Next up is Mark Chivers on how good analysis is presented and its presentation drives decisions at Boots. Can I please welcome up Mark? Thank you.
Afternoon all. I find myself between prize giving and lunch. Never a good locational decision, but so be it, so be it. What I am going to talk about, I'm going to move the agenda on slightly, hopefully, albeit I guess you will be the judge of that, in terms of talking more about the decision and the influencing end. Just to say a few words first about Boots. A lot of you will think you know about it and some of you may know about it. It's now part of an extremely big company. So Walgreens Boots Alliance has 370,000 employees. It has revenues of just over $100 billion a year now. And as well as the 3,000 stores in the UK that I look after, we've got 1,000 in Mexico, 400 in Chile, 8,500 in the US, 150 in Norway. I'm losing touch, 400 in Thailand, some in the Middle East. I found out yesterday that we got some in Lithuania. And a couple of weeks ago found out that we got nearly 400 in China. So it continues to grow, and that's sort of half the business, because the other half of the business is the pharmaceutical wholesale business. So a fascinating business to be in. And I chaired this a little while ago, 12 years ago, I think, or 11 years ago. And the amount of change that has happened in that time is quite astronomical, and I'm going to come on and talk about that in a moment. I just have to warn you first that there is an element of audience participation. Now, I realise for a group of analysts and data monkeys that might cause you some anxiety, but it will be all right. Bear with me, and we'll get through it together. Alan talked about context and how important context was. And I've just mentioned the increasing change agenda across the world, across Boots. We're making decisions now in what I think, and maybe it's because I'm getting old, the fastest moving environment that I've certainly ever been part of. And business models are going out of fashion like there's no tomorrow and are having to change. Rising customer expectations to innovate and adapt. Boots, part of WBA, Walgreens Boots Alliance, is now a global operator to drive margin, to drive cost, etc., but still has to function at the ultimate local level and at customer-specific level. So you've got that massive diversion between operating globally and operating locally. New generations finding their voice through digital. I won't tell you what my boys do on digital, but it blows my mind. I just don't understand where they are. But trust remains the greatest issue. And increasingly now, with more information, with more decisions to make, trust is fundamental to that, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So that's the economic, that's the corporate context for decision making. And the question I ask with that is, can we make rational decisions? I'm not sure we can. Maybe we can, maybe we can't. Our customers are making normative and rational decisions, and I'll come back and define what I mean by that in a minute. We know that our customers are flipping between the digital world and the physical world seamlessly. Andy's bored at the back and he's on his phone looking at something as we speak. Come on, Andy, cheer up. But that becomes the norm. We're spending hundreds of millions of pounds to enable that, to try and get customers to be able to switch seamlessly. We have personal relationships with shops and brands we trust. We've talked about trust already. Trust fundamental to Boots. We have customers who have been using number 7 for 80 years. And that's not just the women. So absolutely astonishing relationship with a brand and an ongoing relationship with brands. And easy and fast, and we want it now, etc., etc. So we set the context. The context is that it's absolutely mad out there. The world is changing faster. Can we make decisions? And I give you sort of 2 different sides of the story about decision making. From the perspective of the decision maker, a very simple model is that there are 2 different types of decision making. We can make a rational decision or we can make a normative decision. So a rational decision is, what are my options? What are the variants of those options? I'm going to assess those options. I'm going to pick the best one, and then I'm going to evaluate it afterwards. And I suspect that fundamentally is what a lot of us do in the room, or what we try and promote in our businesses and in our organisations. But there are also normative decisions, and I'm very conscious that I use normative decision making all the time. So as Lisa would say at the back, and has educated me, I know that if we can generate an extra £1,000 of sales a week in a boot store, that's worth about £100,000 of value on an MPV. I know that if a rent is £100,000 on Oxford Street, then the freehold value is about 40 times that. It's about £4 million. So we use heuristics, we use rules of thumb, we use models all the time to help our rational decision making, because actually it's just getting too complex out there. The world is too mad for us. So we're switching between normative and rational, but we're pushing rational, and I'll come back to that again in a minute. The other thing is, I suspect a lot of our job, certainly a lot of my job, and a lot of the job of the people who work with me and for me, is about influencing decision makers. So we talked about the decision makers and how decisions are making, but actually our role is about influencing them and helping people to make decisions. And I just give you this, again, a very simple model of how we influence and how we try and influence and how you can influence decision makers. And I come on to persuasion, because persuasion is the natural, rational model making, and we'll talk about that in a bit more in a second. But I thought how I would demonstrate this is I'd relay the conversation that Keith and I had on the phone when I was on the way up to Manchester, where he was trying to get me to come and speak at the conference. So this was Keith's way of influencing me to come and present today. And he started with the visionary. He said, Mark, wouldn't it be fantastic to come and present on this platform with all of these wonderful speakers, and you can demonstrate. And of course, that didn't really have that much sort of persuasive power with me. But visionary and setting the vision is the first method. And then he got very empathetic and reflective, and he said, Mark, what would you like to get out of coming and presenting at the conference? What would be good for you? What would work for you? What could we do for you to make... And again, that didn't have much. Then he sort of said, just come and present at my conference. And lastly, he said, Mark, I'd really like you to come and present at the conference. Haven't seen you for a while. A chance to meet up with some old colleagues, some old friends, and I'll buy you a beer. And it was the persuasive thing that worked. So again, I wanted to say all that, and I'm not going to come back to that piece about influencing, but all of our roles in terms of providing data is very persuasive, it's very rational. Sometimes, again, as we will come on to, that's not the thing that helps make the decision. So, we're going to talk about what we do most of, which is rational decision making and persuasion. I'm using some of, I think, out of James's book. So James, forgive me for not referencing you. I got them off the BBC website. And this was some of the great visualising. So this was going back to, I really liked this one. So this is passport stamps of people in London, where their passport is, where they're from, and I guess the visualisation of James's colleague is it's turned it into a sort of map of the world as well. And I thought absolutely brilliant, absolutely love it, great visualisation, great data. You've already seen that one. Again, it's just mind-boggling in terms of the census data and the travel to work. Absolutely brilliant, fantastic. But I showed both of those because they don't help me make any decisions. So we need the context, we need the financials, we need what we're trying to make a decision on. So visualization of data will only take you so far. So in all of these presentations, you have to show something from the Harvard Business Review, don't you? Because that is the wisdom of these things. So I thought I'd show you two things from the Harvard Business Review, from Brian and from Max. And for those of you at the back, I'll read them out. For the big decisions in life, says Brian, you need to reach a deeper region of consciousness. Making decisions then becomes not so much about deciding as letting inner wisdom emerge. We've been bamboozled into believing that cognition is rational, that our mind is a gigantic computer or a blackboard on which we can reach a decision by calculating pluses and minuses. Recent research on cognition shows that our minds rarely make strictly logical deductions. Instead, we rely on patterns, on feelings associated with those patterns. Whereas Max, on the other hand, says, when making a decision, don't listen to your intuition. Intuition will lead you astray. It's drastically overrated, etc., etc. So two, from the experts, completely contrasting statements about how decisions make, and how I would characterize those is one's normative and one's rational. So, are you ready for your audience participation? What we're gonna try and do is we're going to try and make a decision. Okay? So, you have three options. I'm going to show you something, and the question on the board is, would you have bought? Okay? And I'm going to show you some data. And what I want you to do, and this is where the complexity gets in, if you would have bought, I want you to put your right arm up. If you wouldn't have bought, I want you to put your left arm up. And if you don't know and can't decide, I want you to stand up. Okay? All right? And I'll show it you for, I don't know, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, so you can read it, as much of it as you can. So, right arm for those who would have bought, left arm for those who wouldn't have bought, and stand up for those who can't make a decision. Brilliant. Now, forgive me for getting you to hold your arms up just for a little bit. So, Keith, why would you have bought?
Oh, one-off opportunity. Go for it.
Okay. Who else? Who else is a yes? And tell me the reason for why you would have bought. Someone at the front.
General optimism. That looks like a good deal.
General optimism, good deal. Thank you very much. Those who have their left arm up, so all the rights can put their arm down. The lefts, gentleman at the front. Why would you not have bought?
There's more and more fine print.
The devil is in the detail. Brilliant. The other gentleman at the front. Sorry, I don't know your name.
You're right. Nasty looking interest rate was what I thought I picked up.
Okay. And so left arms can go down. And Ian, why wouldn't you have made a decision?
Don't make quick decisions on buying land in Nebraska.
Paul?
Yeah, couldn't read the bottom at the time available NAF place. NAF concept.
Brilliant. All right, thank you very, very much. So I would say that all of you who have put your left arm or your right arm up have made a normative decision, because there's not enough information there for you to make an educated decision. There are sort of implications about it doesn't look very much money, it's not very well developed. Iowa and Nebraska are going to be developed in the future, but what were the alternatives, etc., etc.? Could you have invested in California at the same time? I think those of you who stood on the fence actually probably made the more rational decision. And no surprise, therefore, that Mr. Sterling and Mr. Longley on my left have made intensely rational decisions. I show that for a reason, because and those of you who know me well and have seen me present before will have seen me present this slide. This is really my only slide, which is in the sense that when we make location decisions and property decisions in Boots, what we're doing all of the time is trying to draw apart these circles to understand the pound notes or the dollars or the Norwegian kroner or wherever it is, the Mexican peso in the middle. We're trying to understand the impact of demography, the impact of retail environment, which is how nice it is, etc., etc., the competition impact, what we're trying to sell, and macroeconomy. And you can sort of apply this to the Iowa-Nebraska decision as well. So what would we have looked at in that case? Well, okay, so what's the economic prospects for Nebraska and Iowa over the next period of time? Actually, what are we buying the land for in terms of customer offer? Are we going to farm it? Are we going to mine it? Are we going to develop it? Competition, so what are the prices in other parts of the US? What are other people doing with the land that they've already bought? Demography, who's there already? What's the population? What's the business world? And retail environment, is it a good place to be? And all the time what we're doing is trying to take the circle out of the rings, look at it, understand the impact on the pound notes of those, put it back to make an educated, rational, persuasive decision. What I thought I would show, and I was going back through some old presentations I made, and I don't think I ever did it here, but I know Andy had a geobusiness conference in 2002, 2003, and I presented this slide, which was probably some work Ian did for me at the time, but it shows that fundamentally it hasn't changed, and what it's about is this was our Advantage card, so this was our sales, looking at actual Advantage card sales for the Oldham area, for North East Manchester, and looking at the gaps in the market. And that's what we're doing all the time. So this was the interaction between spend, demography, customer offer, etc. If I bring this right up to date, Tom's been doing some brilliant work. Tom's at the back doing some brilliant work in Mexico. So we've bought a 1,000 store chain in Mexico, and we're trying to apply some of our techniques from Nottingham into Mexico and talking to Mexico. And this is the beauty market in Mexico. And what Tom's done is he's taken the census data, so we've got a demography split, we've got some spend data in terms of a national picture, cross-reference the two, built some models around propensity to spend, and then look at what we've got across the Mexican market in terms of opportunity. We've then gone the stage further, which we'll come on to, looked at how our stores in Mexico, how those 1,000 stores are performing, so that we can start to look at the gaps in the market and make some recommendations. So it's the same thing, it's drawing the rings apart. And forgive me, I'm not sure how well you can see this. So Benavides, which is the WBA chain in Mexico, has 1,000 stores in Mexico. Population of Mexico is about 110 million, 120 million. And they have 192 stores in Monterrey, in one city. What we've done is we've been using those patterns of performance to build out, looking at where we would put more stores in Monterrey, even if we did, and looking at the opportunities around the rest of the country. Brilliant rational analysis. And we sat down with a Mexican team to talk them through it, and they were overwhelmed with it, thought it was brilliant. And then we said, well, we should be focusing on this area of Mexico and this area of Mexico because there are lots of wealthy people here and you haven't got any stores. And they said, well, that's where all the drug dealers are, and that's where... So again, it's this build-up of the different data sources, the use of the normative as well as the rational. Again, I feel a bit of a fraud presenting this, but we got to a stage in Boots where we were being very rational. And there was still a normative bit coming in. People were still using their judgment, still overriding some of the decision makers. So we went to ultra rational. And we went to a partnership with a company called Applied Predictive Technologies, who were a group of statisticians. Some of you may know them, came out of the US. They were a KKR company, like we were for a period of time. And what they do, they've used the different stats models in different industries to bring it into retail and into retail performance. So a rubbish example of what they do is they use, for example, some of the stats around unit tracker funds, so building representations of unit trust that are going to map the FTSE to provide a contrast set of stores for a trial. So if you can get the components of a particular store's function and performance by building up different performances from other stores, then you've got the perfect control that when you deliver a store change, you can measure genuinely what the impact of that change is. And it takes away arguments about, well, the store manager's in there really good, or we're digging up the road, or it's not a true trial because B&M have just moved into the town, or whatever it is. So some really clever stuff. And that genuinely helped decision making for a period of time, because it was so rational and it was so statistical and specific that it became very difficult to have arguments with. But that's now losing its way a little bit within Boots, and some of the normatives, some of the heuristics, some of the rules of thumb are starting to countermand it. So, we've talked about the rational decision making, we've talked about persuasion, and absolutely that's what my team, the location team, are doing in Boots all the time, presenting this rational argument that then gets combined with financial arguments to make business change cases. I thought I'd share a couple of examples with you of where perhaps the decision making has been more normative. So not a very good picture. Forgive me, I got it off Google. Anyone know where that is? Anyone want to hazard a guess? Lise, you're not allowed. Waterloo Station. Quite right. We've opened a new store a few years ago now in Waterloo Station at a time just before we did the merger with Walgreens Boots Alliance, when we still had probably 6 or 7 billion of debt. And all of the property team, all of the location team convinced, slam dunk decision, really great location for a store. It was a 2-floor store, which at that point, I don't think we had any other stations with 2-floor stores. And our CFO, who is a guy called George Fairweather, intensely rational, intensely clever man, he didn't like it. He didn't like the decision. So what made the decision and what got the decision through in that case was we had the bright idea, or someone in the team had the bright idea of making a big play on that Boots lozenge. It is simply vast. So we did some benchmarking in terms of what that size of advertising hoarding would cost on Oxford Street or with that sort of footfall. And actually, the business case got through on the basis of, yes, we were going to open a fantastic store, but we had a massive brand presence in one of the busiest footfall locations in the UK. What we've got is a picture, bottom left, of George actually opening the store. So he was then convinced and bought into it. Another one for you. Anyone hazard a guess where that is? Tom, you're not allowed. Anyone? No?
Westport.
Very good, very good. Who said that? Very good indeed. So, Westport. A few years ago, we were expanding our Irish chain. We're up to now 70-odd stores in the Republic. At the time, we were probably at about 25, 30. And big push. So the context at the time was a big push to open stores in Ireland, and we'd done all of the clever stuff, all of the decision-making analysis, ranking the opportunities, etc., etc. And Westport was never very far up the list, but what came up, as it always does, is an opportunity. So I went over there. It took me a day to get there. I went round it in about an hour and a half, and it took me a day to get back. And I was really worried by it. It didn't quite pass the sniff test, and presented it to the executive, and my anxiety was coming through. And they sort of asked all of the rational questions, and in terms of persuading, I was sort of getting more and more desperate in terms of saying, and I said, but it's a lovely little Georgian town. And they said, oh, well, in that case, let's open the store. And genuinely, that, because the context at the time was they wanted to make the decision, they wanted the affirmation, they wanted the expansion, that was what triggered our decision to go into Westport. And it's still open and it's still above water, so all good. So the intentionally rational organisation, but there are things that come on top of that. So I should have said at the beginning, Keith set me the title, so that was what the title is. Hopefully that's what I've talked about, but probably what I've talked about a bit more is that should have been the title. How good analysis in its presentation mostly drives locational decisions at Boots, as long as the context is understood and as long as the decision maker, and it really is them making the decision, is receptive to being persuaded, understanding the constraints that they are under, because it feels much more like that. And that's me.
Does anybody have any questions for Mark?
Hi.
Hi. You talked about how the retail environment's changing and all the digital things are making your job harder. How have you had to change your data analysis procedures considering the changing environment?
It's a great question. I'm probably the wrong person to be talking about it, but I'll have a go. It was mentioned in the CDRC presentation, the work at Liverpool about the work on internet propensities and internet shopping. We're just at the start. Again, my colleague Tom Patterson at the back has started to do some work using that data, and I think that's quite an exciting source of data. But what we have got to make the decisions on going forward is how fast that channel is going to grow, how that then impacts the real estate, because you could argue with our click and collect service, which is growing like topsy at the moment, that actually in those areas of highest propensity we need more space rather than less space. You could also argue it both ways. So I think it's a bit of watch this space at the moment. Because we're watching this space, we're continuing to do what we've done before and fit in all of the click and collect and everything else around it. But it's a massive growing. The evolution of retail, or the revolution of retail at the moment, is staggering.
Any other questions?
you all want your lunch?
We now have a lunch break, but thank
No,
you
you've
very
got another
much.
question first.
Oh,
Quick question. You mentioned that it's swinging back from an ultra-rational algorithmic stance to something a bit more normative. Could you say why?
So I don't want to overplay it, but predominantly Boots is intensely rational. The heritage is pharmacy, albeit the heritage of pharmacy, whilst it's core to the business, it's not quite as strong in terms of the leadership. So it's an intensely rational organisation. There are things that at times, going back to where I started, because of complexity, because of pace of change, because of people's views, what I didn't say was George used to come through Waterloo every day, or he commuted in through Waterloo, and he saw all of the disruption that was going on in the with the move of the parish trains, etc., etc. So it had been a building site for however many years. So all of that personal feel at the top of the organisation has to be countermanded, has to be informed, has to be talked round. We had another very interesting conversation with him when we were looking to open Westfield, East London, the Olympic site, because he just had one of his very senior financial controllers was from Atlanta, where obviously they'd had the Olympics a few years previously, and what had happened in Atlanta, very different economics and very different retail market, was a number of shopping centres had built up around the locations of the Olympics, and then when the Olympics had gone, they'd all gone bust or whatever. So this was the fear, and you build into you. We're all different. We all have different experiences. We're all a product of our different lives, different experiences, different decisions. So that's what has got to be talked through. That's what's got to be countermanded. That's what's got to be unpicked. So we're not swinging back. I think it's probably there has always been the personal impression, the normative part of decision making. Maybe we just listen a bit harder to it now. Is it lunch?
thank you very much for that.